Okay, so siblings. I love these quotes. Siblings are a link to our past and a bridge to our future, which I think is just wonderful. But I think the reality is siblings, the only enemy you can't live without. So why do we study these siblings? So first of all, this is about understanding this interconnected, interdependent nature of the subsystems within the family. So we know that families are connected. We know that each individual member of the family will affect each other, positive, negative, neutral, but there is an impact between the individual people within the family. So the sibling relationship is one of the most enduring relationships across the lifespan. We are generally know our siblings from birth till death. We don't choose them. They generally just come along and we're stuck with them. And these relationships are quite often very emotionally intense. We spend probably the most time during our childhood with our siblings more than anyone else. We also want to study siblings because we want to understand these nuances in the relationships, and particularly in siblings where children have autism and intellectual disabilities. And the end result of this really is to build better, more tailored support systems for these siblings. So my research, my thesis title was Sibling Outcomes and Perspectives of Their Relationship When One Child is Autistic, and an examination of the bidirectional relationships between autistic children and their siblings. So what did that mean? What we were looking at was this new understanding of the sibling relationship between autistic and non-autistic children, the identification of subgroups of autistic children, so not this sort of one thing that fits all, and so to look at whether there were these subgroups and what the associations were with the relationship quality and the outcomes of their non-autistic siblings. Another area was this recognition of the role that spoken language plays in a sibling relationship, and whether warmer, closer relationships were connected to lower behavioural problems in the autistic child. And then the last thing was, it was the role that challenging behaviour plays in the sibling relationship, and whether that's not as straightforward as has been thought. So I carried out 4 studies. The first 2 are quantitative research. Now, because I'm very aware of the fact that we have quite a lovely mix today of parents and professionals, etc., what I'm not going to do is go into a huge amount of statistical and data analysis. If anybody really wants the in-depth notions of cluster and latent profile analysis, I can happily send you the papers and you can read them at your leisure. But if we tried to do it today, we'd probably be here for the rest of the day. So there were these 2 papers, and these were both about looking at groupings within autistic children. So the second 2 studies I did were qualitative research. And this was about getting out there and getting to the bones of people. I think that these sort of, with quantitative, we're able to take these massive data sets and really understand large groups of people. But what we can't do is understand the individual. So it felt really important to me that not only did I go out and actually speak to siblings, but also that I was able to go and speak to the autistic child and the sibling together. So moving on, I'm going to, like I said, briefly go through these 4 studies and then look at the messages that came from all of them. So this first one, which was about sibling adjustment and sibling relationships. So this was a piece of cluster analysis, and what cluster analysis is a data analysis method where it's hierarchical. It takes a huge amount of data to start with, and through the wonders of technology, it it takes it down and it looks for similarities between the groups. And then with that, what we see are these clusters, and we can look to see whether these similarities make sense. So with this particular piece of research, we used a piece of study data called the Family Study, which was data analysis or data that was collected back in 2012. And there were 168 primary carers and 129 secondary carers within this data set that we had. The inclusion criteria was that they had to have an autistic child and a non-autistic sibling. And as you can see, we had 137 male and 31 female. With this piece of research, there were two measures used. There was the parent measures, which looked at social communication, the social communication questionnaire, which and the VABS, which is Vineland Adaptive Behaviour Rating Scales, which looks at things like communication and daily living skills, etc. We then had sibling measures, so the siblings filled in the sibling relationship questionnaire and also heart of self-perception. So what did we find? We found we had 5 clusters. So this was 5 groups of autistic children that grouped together, had enough similarities to place them in one group together. So the first group that we found had a profile of being highly anxious, high behavioural problems, but had a lower autism profile. The second group was what we called the complex needs care and support needs group. So they had the highest autism profile, so autism symptoms, and they had the lowest level of communication. The third group was this high anxiety and behavioural model. And again, they sort of had this moderate autism profile. The fourth group had, again, what we class as a lower autism symptoms, but high behavioural problems. But they also had a high level of self-help skills. So they were able to do things within their own lives, etc. So they were quite high at able to do those things. Then we had this fifth group, which were the high self-help skills, but they also had high behavioural problems and a low autism profile. So when we looked at these clusters and then we brought in the siblings, so the siblings of each of the children that fell within these clusters. So the siblings of the people in the first group, the children in the first group, reported high conflict and low warmth and closeness. The siblings in the second group reported low conflict, low warmth, and low closeness. So this was actually the lowest conflict group. The third group we had, oh, sorry, I don't know what I've just done there. There we go. So the third group that we had had the where were we? Sorry, the highest conflict, high anxiety, high behavioural. The fourth group, again, lower autism symptoms, but these high levels of anxiety and higher warmth and closeness. And then the fifth group with this high anxiety, high warmth and closeness and lower conflict group. So as you can see, what we were talking about at the beginning, this sort of complex care needs group, for example, in cluster 2, the lowest communication actually reported the lowest conflict, but high conflict was seen where there was a high level of anxiety, behavioural problems, etc., but not necessarily a higher autism profile. So what did study 1 tell us? It tells us that the clusters of the autistic children with the high communication skills had more conflict in their relationship. We saw that high anxiety, so internalising, often created higher conflict in these relationships. And then we saw that low anxiety and lower behavioural problems appear to result in lower conflict. Now, this was reported both by the primary and secondary carer and by the children themselves. So the second study was, again, a second quantitative research study. And this looked, what we wanted to do was say, okay, we found these things out in the first study. Now, can we replicate that and see if that's True. So we used a slightly different analysis, something called latent profile analysis, and a different data set. So again, we were looking at children who were autistic, but these were a group of children from the 1,000 Families study, which was a piece of research that is a longitudinal piece of research that's been going on for a number of years. This was wave one data, and we had a larger data set with this. So we had 318 families who met the criteria. And the criteria was that they had to have an autistic child with an intellectual disability, and that they had to sit within certain age groups, as did the siblings, and that they were living in the same home again. As you can see, there is a higher predominance of male autistic children to female, which again, with prevalence rates of autism, is probably what we would expect to see. And again, we had these profiles. So with this one, we just looked at conflict. So we had these 5 groups again, and again, 5 groups made sense with the statistical analysis with using this latent profile analysis data method. So we had a group who were classed as having a severe intellectual disability, but had low disruptive behaviours and anxiety. We had a severe intellectual disability, but high disruptive behaviours, but were less anxious. This mild to moderate group with high anxiety and disruptive behaviours. A mild to moderate group with high disruptive anxiety, but high communication. And then this 5th group was, again, mild to moderate intellectual disability with low disruptive anxiety, but high communication skills. And what did we see then with conflict? So what was reported was that the lowest conflict was seen in this group with the severe intellectual disability and autism, but low disruptive behaviours and anxiety. The second group reported moderate conflict. The third group, where there was a mild to moderate intellectual disability, but really high levels of anxiety and disruptive behaviours, reported the highest conflict. And then the 2 other groups reported high levels of conflict as well. And these 2 groups, as you can see, both had high communication skills. So again, what does this tell us? It tells us that the profiles of the autistic children with these high communication skills had more conflict. And that was regardless of anxiety and disruptive behaviours. The low anxiety, low disruptive behaviours coupled with severe intellectual disabilities appeared to result in lower conflict, but these were only parent reports. And as I said, what's really important in our research is that we actually speak to the people who the research is about. And in this case, this was the siblings. So this moved us on then to these last 2 studies. And we have the one study, the first one, study 3, which was entitled "It Feels Very Weird and Normal at the Same Time." So this was sibling perceptions of their relationship with an autistic brother or sister with complex care needs. So this piece of research I carried out, I went and interviewed these siblings. We interviewed them away from their parents. It felt important that the children were able to have these conversations in a free way, and the children were quite happy to do that. Obviously, we got consent from everybody to do this, and we carried them out in the children's homes, mostly. And 10 of them I did in the children's homes, and 1 I did in a pub garden. But they were comfortable in that environment. So the autistic children profile were, again, there were 9 male, again, a higher predominance of male autistic children to female. We had 6 of them were older, 4 younger, and we had 1 twin dyad, which was really nice. And then the siblings, again, 3 male, 8 female, and obviously the opposites to the older, younger, and still the twin. And what we did is we used a process called a reflective thematic analysis. And what this does is it allows us to delve into these interviews. So the interviews were all transcribed, there were field notes taken, and then we went back and listened to the interviews and reread the interviews again and again and again. And what we're looking for, again, is, are there similarities? Are there themes that are building within these data sets? It is a very long process. Even with 11 interviews, it took a long time to take all this information. But what we ended up with are these themes. So 4 themes. The first one, positive interactions bring joy. So this was about the interactions between the siblings. So what they experienced, what their connections were. The second one was about this verbal interaction. So did it increase sibling conflict? So when there was language in the relationship, was there a change in the levels of conflict as described by the sibling? The third one we looked at was whether behaviours may have different meanings. So were the siblings not misunderstanding, but were they confused or contradictory in their meanings in terms of how the behaviours of their autistic brothers and sisters were translated by them as children? And then the last one we looked at were these changes within the sibling relationship. So this was looking about how they felt their relationship had changed in terms of over time and things that they felt they could change themselves. So the first theme, these positive interactions bring joy. Now, I always think the best way of showing these themes are to use the words of the children themselves. So the types of things that the children said were, when he goes to the park, he mostly loves climbing. He loves it when I try the same thing as him. Once I was really scared, and B was cheering me on to get up, which was really nice. And I was really proud that he did that. We then saw examples like where the sibling didn't necessarily enjoy the game, but what they enjoyed was the interaction and that connection that they had with their sibling. So one of the children said, like, recently he's been wanting to play the floor is lava. It's when you say floor is lava and then 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and you have to get on something. I don't enjoy the game, but I like doing it with him. And then we had, I love it because he likes playing with all of us and he likes playing with balls. And I pass him the ball and sometimes he throws it back or rolls it or does that, or sometimes it goes behind him. Now, all 3 of these children were actually non-verbal. So it's really interesting when they talk about he was cheering me on, he does this, we do that, he says. But actually the autistic children were not using language. But there was a real sense of joy within these interviews when these siblings discussed how they interacted with their non-verbal brother or sister. So this second theme, does verbal interaction increase sibling conflict? I'm actually going to come back to this one because we're going to have a more sort of in-depth look at this whole idea of verbal interaction and conflict. So just briefly, what we saw with this particular data set was that when the autistic children use spoken language as their primary means of communication, the siblings were more likely to describe conflicts as being prevalent in their relationship. And then we had these non-verbal brothers and sisters. So they had limited or non-verbal. So we would use things like echolalic, repetitive with minimal understanding or minimal words, or completely non-verbal with very limited understanding. And this was reported by the parent. And what we saw was that these relationships were in the main non-combative, but I'm going to come back to the quotes from the children for that in a moment. So the third theme was behaviours may have different meanings. And what we saw here was this really sort of contradictory relays from the children, from the siblings about their autistic brother or sister. So this child said, so it's like living with a noisy person who always screams when you wake up in the morning. And whenever you try to play with him when he's in a bad mood, he'll probably kill you because he has to be in the right mood. Oh, but I love playing with him. He's fun. And when he pinches people, it means he's happy. So this child, the sibling, was actually translating that pinches, which normally would be seen as a negative behaviour, were actually seen as a positive behaviour. And we saw this in other conversations as well, where they talked about sometimes, sort of behaviours that were pinching or punching or biting and things like that, but they weren't seen as negative. They were seen as interactions. And then the other thing that we saw was where the siblings would see things that we would probably class as being maybe dangerous or not positive actions. So this child she said he climbs out of the window sometimes. He's been on my roof, the mini roof outside my room, and it's so funny. Now, this child also described how her brother would fill the toilets with toilet paper and like I said, climb out of windows and everything. But she wasn't describing it as being something that could harm him or was negative. So the fourth thing we looked at was this sort of theme of changing a sibling relationship. So how did the siblings feel their relationship had changed over time, and what did they feel that they could change within their own relationship? So one child said, back then he used to just cry, and now he doesn't cry. He just hits and bites people. He doesn't know what to do. He gets frustrated. So they can see that there's a real change in how their brother used to be and how he is now. Another child said, if I could play with him more and talk to him more so he can learn stuff, I just want to be a better brother. Now, personally, when I was interviewing this child, I found that quite heartwarming. He was a wonderful, wonderful brother to his nonverbal little brother, but he really felt that he could be doing more and more and more to make him progress, his autistic brother progress more. And then the other thing that we saw, which came up as well within this theme, was children who were younger behaving as if they were older. So one child said, I'd look after him as a big sister. Now, she was actually 5 years younger than her brother. And as you can see, she saw herself as a big sister, not as a little sister to him, because she was carrying that role of a big sister in helping him and caring for him and doing things with him. So what did this study tell us? It told us that relationships are different and the impact on the individual sibling should be evaluated individually. It's not enough to say, well, they're the sibling of a child who's autistic and therefore support should be. It's very much about looking at these individual relationships and looking at how they're different and what the impact is. Now, this next thing is that, this whole concept of that complex care and support needs and a lack of spoken language or communication do not necessarily equate to poor relationships. And that's quite interesting because when we go back to the quantitative data, we saw parents actually reporting that there was that the complex care and supports needs group actually had less warm relationships. But what we saw when we interviewed and spoke to these children was that they actually talked about much warmer and loving relationships. Again, stereotypical negative behaviours are not always perceived negatively or antagonistically by the siblings. So children may need a different way to play, for example. So one of the examples that was given by some of the children who had more negative relationships was that if they played on a game, then they could play together, but they didn't knock up against each other. There was a lack of conflict. Now, the fourth study, again, was about speaking to the individuals of whom we are carrying out this research. But in this particular research, we were really lucky that we were able to access data, and this was interview data, where both an autistic child who was verbal and their non-autistic sibling were both interviewed. So this has given us this really unique input into looking at both sides of the story as such. So again, we had a small data set with the qualitative data. Quite often it is smaller data sets. So we had 12 sibling dyads, so 24 in total, 12 autistic, 12 siblings, and across a range of ages and male and female. So again, we used thematic reflexive analysis. So again, this was looking at these interviews and seeing whether there were themes within them, and whether there were similarities in what these children were telling us. So we came up with three group themes within this piece of research. So we looked at, the first one is, how do we describe each other? So individually, our own interpretations of each other. The second one was spending time together, so connection and disconnection in the relationship. And then the third group theme was being a sibling, what it means to me. So theme one, how we describe each other, our own interpretations. So first of all, we have the autistic children. What were they telling us? They were telling us really, really factual things. He's got eyes, he's got smelly feet, he's the oldest, he's taller. What they weren't doing was talking about their non-autistic siblings' personality or things that they liked about them. They just used an absolute, when I said, can you describe, it was a physical description. Whereas the non-autistic siblings used much more descriptive language. They talked about their personality. They talked about things about them. They're unique, but in a nice way. She's nice and stuff. He's funny, he's cute. They understood that not everybody would be able to understand him. She's rough in play, but when you get to know her, she's not so bad. So these were quite positive descriptions by the non-autistic children. So the second one about spending time together, this connection and disconnection. So the autistic children said, again, it was quite negative or neutral in its tone. I don't really do anything with her. I let her play. I rarely spend time with her. I don't usually play with her, to be honest. We usually just do our own thing. So probably only if my mum says go. But what did the non-autistic siblings say to us? What did they enjoy? I enjoy playing on his Xbox as he teaches me how it works. She's kind of more like a friend than a sister, a more relaxed kind of friendship between siblings. He loves playing with me and looks up to me. So if I do anything wrong, it's just he just does it as well because he copies me. Now, what's really interesting is this first quote of playing on his Xbox as he teaches me how it works. Her autistic sibling said, I let her play. So he did not see this as a fun interaction between the two of them, as something they were doing together. He saw it as something that he let her do. And the more of a friend than a sister, more a relaxed sort of relationship between siblings. I don't know if you can guess where this one comes with. And this was, I don't usually play with her, to be honest. We just do our own thing. So again, the siblings were actually giving quite different ideas about what they felt their relationship was. So the third theme was being a sibling, what it means to me. So we asked them about their brother or sister. What does it mean to have a brother or sister? What do you like about your brother or sister? And again, the autistic children, it was quite straight to the point. Interestingly, with this particular question, 9 out of the 12 autistic children couldn't give an answer. They just said, I don't know, or nothing. But the 3 that gave an answer said things like, I have another brother who's a dog, my dog brother. Why can he not sleep with me? I like that he's really tall. He buys Lego and I play with it. So that's a very functional relationship. And their non-autistic siblings, when asked what they liked, one child said everything. I love everything about them. He tells lots of funny jokes. Some of his jokes don't even make sense, but it's funny. He can be really nice sometimes, but he can also be annoying. But most of the time, he's nice. So again, there's this real disparity between these very factual comments that the autistic children are saying, and then the more descriptive and positive comments that their siblings, the non-autistic siblings, are telling us. So what does it tell us? Well, it told us that sibling reports are broadly in line with this existing sibling research, so with positives and negatives. So the non-autistic siblings were pretty much telling it as we know it is. There's good, there's bad, there's neutral. But the autistic children were not typically using positive describing positive relationships in their own words. Like I said, a lot of the time they either couldn't answer a question, or they would use "I don't know" or "no," or more negative words. And I think this point is really interesting. We choose our friends, but not our family. So quite often the autistic children were, if they talked about friends at school, for example, they had much more positive language to use, because they were people that they chose to be with. They didn't choose to be with their siblings. And I think also, just to go back on that, we have to we do have to consider that the autistic children are literally telling it like it is. They are not perhaps prescribing to the social niceties that their non-autistic siblings may be using, and they're just saying, "I do not like them," or "I don't want to play with them." Whereas the non-autistic children were more likely to give positive views, because perhaps the social norms dictate that that's what we should say. And again, this goes back to this importance of listening to all aspects. It's really important that we listen to both children, the autistic children and their brothers and sisters. So, severity and communication. So this is severity of intellectual disability and autism. So the three questions: does this change the type of relationship? What do siblings tell us? And what can we as parents do to support these siblings? So just going to go back to study 1. And as you can see, we had, just going to pull out these 3 groups. So this complex care needs and support needs group, so these were the children with the most complex needs, and they were the ones where the lowest conflict was reported. They had the lowest communication scores and the highest support and care needs. We then had this high anxiety, high behavioural problems group, but with a lower autism profile. They reported high conflict. And this third group, again, high anxiety, high behavioural problems, this sort of sat in the middle moderate autism profile. They recorded the highest conflict within the whole group. And then on the second study, again, we see this. We see that the severe intellectual disability and autism with the low disruptive behaviours and low levels of anxiety recorded the lowest conflict between the siblings. And again, we see these 3 groups where there was high communication, high anxiety, disruptive behaviours. We saw high conflict. Now, it's interesting to look at group 5, actually, where you had this mild to moderate ID. Actually, they reported low disruptive and anxiety issues within the children, but they had high communication skills, and that's where the conflict came back in again. But what did the children tell us? So again, we're just going to have a look at study 3. So these are the quotes that the non-autistic, the non-verbal, sorry, these are the quotes that the brothers and sisters of the non-verbal autistic children told us within that study. They said things like, mainly, so this was in response to, do they have difficulties within their relationship? And they said, no, we don't, mainly because we don't really wind each other up. It's just like we either play together or he'll sit next to me and hug me. But say if he's having a meltdown, he'll come up against me and put his head against mine. So she was seeing a positive, even when her brother was having a meltdown. The positive for her was that he would actually come and sit with her. We can't really fight as he has no words to say. And again, they were equating language with conflict. We're not fighting because we can't fight with each other, because fighting is about saying things to each other. He doesn't understand, so I never fight with him. He doesn't understand anything because he's autistic. And then we had, he can't talk or anything, so he's not going to annoy me by doing anything really. And again, it's equating language to conflict. So what did we see within this group? We saw that there was an evidence of absence of negative relationships between the non-verbal or limited verbal ability children and their siblings. And these kids were mostly reporting positive relationships that didn't have conflict in them. But also that these siblings of the non-verbal children, they enjoyed those interactions. It was all about putting a head on the shoulder, throwing a ball, etc. Even if they didn't reciprocate, the fact that the action was there was what these children enjoyed. So then we had, within study 3, we had some children who had verbal autistic brothers and sisters. And this was quite interesting because these were the children who really had really conflict-driven relationships. So one of them said, I sometimes go in a different room, or I sit through it, or I can just go on my Switch and play with my friends, because I do talk to my friends, and sometimes I have the door shut and I put my headphones on and I talk to them, but I don't tell them about it or anything. So she was just shutting herself away. She didn't want to talk to her friends about it. This was just that I have this, conflict-driven relationship with my brother, and I just need to go and be alone. Again, so basically, my room is my shield. It was somewhere for these children to go and just be alone and not have to deal with the conflict. We don't fight as much. Now, this was in response to asking about why they enjoy playing online games. And she said, we don't fight as much when we play online games. And I think this sums it up beautifully. We can see each other and play together, but separately. So they were valuing the time that the siblings were valuing the time that they were spending together, but they weren't physically together. They were together through a game. So when we've got these siblings with verbal autistic brothers and sisters, what did we see? We saw more conflict being described. What we saw was that the verbal autistic children, when they were invoking annoyance, they knew what to do to wind up their brother and sister. And they were described by their non-autistic brother or sister as annoying, mean, grumpy. They described needing time away. And as I said, they used online gaming to play together. So implications for practice. Why is it important that we research this? Why is it important that we understand these relationships? And I said there is a need to really understand how these complexities and individualities of each sibling family group affect each member of the family. So there will be a different effect depending on who the relationship is with. If it's sibling to sibling, sibling to parent, sibling to grandparent, sibling to cousin, etc. So it's understanding these complexities and individualities. I think the second point is really important, and that is the point that external viewers may not fully understand these relationships. The sibling voice is important, and it is independent, and it is an independent reflection of this relationship, and it must be valued. When we speak to families, when we sit in clinics and within interventions, etc., it's really important that sibling voice is heard. And like I said, we can't make assumptions about these relationships. We can't assume that because a child has complex care and support needs, that the siblings are having a negative experience or are not valuing or enjoying their relationship with their autistic brother or sister. And I think this all builds into this future planning. So support for siblings is not one size fits all. We really need to look at what these individual siblings need and look at more tailored interventions. So advice for parents. I'm hoping that Julie is going to appear on my screen at any second.
I'm here.
Oh,
I'm here. Can you see me?
I can. Have I just completely changed the screen?
Yeah, you've got the help, support, advice, and guidance slide there.
Excellent.
All right, lovely. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Louise. That was incredible. I'm going to be trying to demonstrate what Louise has said, but in real life, of what I've been through as a mum. I have 3 children. They are now 22, 20, and 15. and my eldest and youngest both have autism. I'm hoping that by coming on here, I can sort of share some of the ways that I sort of learned as they were growing up. But a lot of it, I kind of think, are things that I wish I maybe had done that I've learned as I've gone through life. One of the key things to me is about education. And I know that's a little bit of the, the sort of academic side of it, which is Louise's side there. But to me, as a mum, the education, it's talking about to your children about what autism is. I think sometimes we assume that children know what these conditions are because autism is a word that can be bounded around in schools, etc. And I think a lot of times we assume that they know, they maybe have known somebody else who's autistic, but don't realize quite how much each person's autism can affect them in such different ways. So trying to educate them, I found really helpful. And obviously that changes throughout their time as they're growing up as well. So keeping that sort of up to date with your children, with this, explaining to the sibling who is non-autistic as to why their sibling might be behaving in the way they are. So one of my children used to lash out when he was younger. He's verbal, but he didn't really understand his emotions. So he used his words, but we found that he kind of went into it more of the fight or flight response. He was very stressed in certain relationships, and could be so overwhelmed that the only way he could feel like to get out of the situation he was in was to fight. It's changed as he's grown up, and he's learnt that he doesn't need to fly anymore. But I found that by explaining to his siblings why he did what he did, rather than just them seeing the negative behavior, that actually it helped them to understand why, and it changed how they then responded to him when he was having these outbursts or meltdowns, as they're called as well. One-to-one time, that kind of was huge for me, realizing that they did need that individual time. Whether or not it was just taking one of them out for hot chocolate in the cafe, going to watch my eldest son playing football, just actually having that quality time with them. Sometimes it'd come up in conversation then about something that was going on at home, just because they felt that they were in a comfortable situation and they were relaxed. And I would find actually that conversations would then come up when we were on our own. But also, I could use it as a way of sort of saying, look, you don't have to deal with your sibling. This is just for you. So I did find that when we got home from their one-to-one time, that their relationship with their sibling was calmer. It just seemed to give them that sort of headspace that they needed. And space, I think, is massive. I think space in every direction, whether or not it's space in the car. How I wish I had realised that one when my children were younger. Ironically, I had one of those seven-seater cars where you can put the boot seats up, but I never did. I squashed them all in the back seats, and they're fighting and shouting and physically sort of nipping at each other. Whereas actually, I could have just given them a little bit of space. I could have had one in the boot and two on either side and kept the middle seat free. So I think space is a massive thing. We did learn in time, and I was fortunate enough to have another room, which I actually could dedicate to my youngest child, whose autism affects him a bit more profoundly than one of his siblings. And we felt that he needed an area to let out his physical emotions. So him having his own space really, really helped him massively, but it helped his siblings too. It meant that they didn't always have to witness what was going on. It gave his siblings had the space as well, so they were happy to kind of um, they had like a beanbag, say, in their room, something like that, where they just knew that they could go to, and that was their own space, and nobody else could use it. So if you haven't even got the space to put like another room, just actually having identifying, say, that is this person's chair, and no one else has to go on it. It just gave them a place where they could just identify it as being theirs and theirs only. Sharing rooms on holiday, oh my goodness me, I just think put them all in, two of them would share one room, two boys would share one room, and my daughter in the other room. And they loved it to begin with. I think having that, like sleepover experience was brilliant. What I wish I had done in hindsight is as they got tireder and tireder as the week had gone on, maybe swap over who was sleeping in that room, or I could have gone in there, that kind of thing. So space is massive. And that also leads me on to the siblings as well. So I think I found that sometimes I wasn't sure if it was me who was worried about the embarrassment or if it was them who was worried about the embarrassment. But sometimes I thought when they invited friends over, when they were younger and friends would come to play after school, that if there was a little bit of outbursts and something like that that I was dealing with their sibling, I wasn't sure how their friends were going to react. So again, having that space, but actually, I think that was a little bit more of my own worry. So I would recommend talking to your children and seeing if that's something that they feel like themselves. Moving on to the next slide, please, Louise. Humor. Um, as all children, we and adults, we all have different humor, don't we? We all find things funny in different ways. But quite often you'll find an autistic person, their humor can be quite factual. It's quite black and white. And I found that one of them would be having a joke with the other didn't get the joke, and then a joke has turned into an argument and a fight because they would have said something and one was said, well, you said that. And he's like, yeah, but I was joking. And it's like, well, I didn't find that funny, so therefore it wasn't humor. So maybe just being aware, and again, that goes back to that educating of kind of, teaching your other children that jokes aren't always funny and explaining that if you say something that actually that autistic person might take it very literally. I do think that support groups are huge. You have things like young carers in schools. Some of the county councils have young carer support groups. You've got the UK charity SIBS, which has support groups for any sibling who has a brother or sister who is growing up or as a child or an adult with a disability. I found that my daughter went to a young carers group in her school, and they used to take her out on school trips. They would take her to places like Alton Towers, Thorpe Park, that kind of thing, which going there as a family, we tried to do and very quickly learned that was something we were never going to do again because it was just so overwhelming for the other children who are autistic. And it prevented her from being able to do what she wanted to do there. So actually, she was over the moon. It meant a little bit of time out of school as well. And she was like, right, great. I'm going to go off to Alton Towers today. And she'd have the opportunity in the support group to talk to other people of her own sort of age. Generally, she often didn't, she would tell me. But she had the opportunity to if she wanted to. And I'm sure some people did take that up. So it's kind of like rewarding in a way of sort of saying, look, you have a lot going on at home, and maybe you can have a little bit of your own time where you're not having to deal with your sibling. You're not having to watch the meltdowns, or you're not having to watch what you're saying, what you're doing. You can just have a little bit of time to yourself. I think you have to be careful on how you do rewards because every person has rewards. And so it's careful on how you're saying it. But I just feel that having somewhere where they can go to where other people understand, but also can have that little bit of time for themselves. The only thing I found is that sometimes I felt like I'd put on a little bit too much responsibility onto the non-autistic sibling. Um, Almost maybe expected a bit more of her because I'm like, well, you haven't got to deal with the autism, so you should be able to do this, that, and the other. Or can you do a bit more of this? Or can you, go and help me, etc. And generally, she's always been very happy with that responsibility. But I think just checking in with them as well to see, make sure that's not become overwhelming for them. And having activities as well. I think for each person, um, I think that goes back to the space, but I think each person having that their own activity where it's they are not having to deal with their sibling. And I think that's whether or not you have autistic or non-autistic or anybody with any disability. I think everybody wants their own space. So having an activity where they can go to and they're not having to deal with their sibling there. But that did for me come with more problems because the PDA side of one of my children's autism meant that when it was time to go out to gymnastics, he didn't want to go. He was like, "Well, there's nothing in it for me. Why should I have to stop what I'm doing because I don't want to go? And then I've just got to sit in the car and drive and then sit in the car and come back and then go back out and get them again." So I did find that over time, I wish that I had been more organized in providing a better support network around me. Um, I found that preparing, that was brilliant, and preparing them for the activity and preparing for school just meant that basically preparation was where it would help the most. So finding out that the school were aware that they might be late going to school because we're dealing with trying to put socks on at home. And when they're not old enough to go to school on their own, well, I'm sorry, but I've got to get the other one ready. And sensory processing disorder does mean that it takes longer to get ready in the morning. So I think the school being aware so that the other child isn't penalised by the fact that they're being late, or they don't have to explain in front of their peers why they've been late again at school. So I think making school very aware of it is important. Holidays, holidays. Now, that always came with its own challenges. And I think we probably, every family will relate to how holidays comes with its own challenges. But you put in autism in that mix there, and we found that that added extra complications. So going to familiar places helped. But on holidays itself, again, space, that's magic word space, so that the siblings still had that space from each other, a bit like maybe they do at home if they're fortunate enough to have their own room at home, that kind of thing. And making sure they're going somewhere familiar, that helped their relationship. But I also found that they could help each other with the holidays with like doing a countdown. So all three of them, we would make a sort of chart, the countdown on how long it is until we go on holiday, what we're going to do on holiday. And I discovered that if I actually discovered that one of my children didn't realize they were coming back from their holiday. So actually, I got them all working together so that they could say, look, we're doing this one today. And I could kind of like give them that responsibility so that it brought their connection together by saying, look, let's go and have a look on our chart. What are we doing today? And it wasn't like, what are you doing? It's what are we doing? So I think having that gave a connection to them, which maybe wouldn't have happened before if I'd have just said, this is what we're doing today. One of them would say, I don't want to do that. The other one's like, I don't want to do that. And then they're arguing between each other saying, well, we don't want to do that. And you've got more sibling rivalry. So the fact it was all kind of mapped out meant it avoided the sibling rivalry, but also kept the family together as a network. It kept that communication. Again, it took me a long time to discover that one. Verbal communication, obviously between siblings, there is a massive amount of sibling rivalry, which is just normal. I did find, though, actually, just sometimes letting them sort it out for themselves, because all three of my children are verbal. Just because they have autism doesn't mean that they couldn't sort out the problems themselves. So, although one part of me is like, please, I need to try and avoid this argument, the other part of me would be thinking, well, do you know what? You can sort that out yourselves. You can work that out. And if I've educated you all correctly, you know that one person's brain is feeling it in a different way. You know one person's sensory processing is struggling. We would walk into a cafe and that would end up in, there's the smell, we're out of here. So sometimes they would have to sort it out themselves. But my final part would be empathy. And you know what? It's given like a real kind of it's developed a massive amount of empathy within themselves actually towards their sibling, and it's given them a real positive bond, because as they've got older, they've understood how the autism affects that person, their sibling, and it's actually created quite a nice warming sort of friendship between them. Ironically, the two autistics, the eldest and the youngest, and my non-autistic, actually get on really well, rather than just brother, sister, all that kind of thing. I actually find they all look after the one whose autism affects him the most. So I've actually found that when it comes to it, the other two will rally around him now. They've grown up, even though they've witnessed some things which have been really, really unpleasant. And they've seen things that I really wish they hadn't seen. But actually, they've now all grown up to actually be really caring people. And I I kind of think if you manage to explain as much as you possibly can about why it's happening, often that gives them the answer as to why. Don't know. I know there's some questions there in the chat, and you'd put
Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much. We'll come back to the questions in a minute. So we're just going to finish up now. Just Julie mentioned some of the support organisations and information for parents and siblings. I mean, obviously, we can't talk about siblings without mentioning the wonderful SIBS charity, whether this is for your child, as a child sibling, an adult sibling, for you as parents, and also for professionals. If you haven't come across them before, or you don't know them, check out their website, because they are a wonderful, wonderful organisation. The other, as Julie's also mentioned, like young carers groups, so local groups that are run within the local authorities, but also there are some third sector groups out there. The other thing I would say with siblings is look at local charities who support children with disabilities, because they quite often offer sibling support too. I know locally to us here in South Wales, we have some amazing third sector, some local charities who support disabled children, and they do amazing sibling work alongside that. Obviously, there are national charities for information. So I can't not mention Cerebra, who have some fantastic guides and that you can download from their website. Also, Contact, the National Autistic Society, etc. have all got sections on siblings within them. And for you as parents, I would say search out your local parent support group. There are local and national ones, but locally, these are the people that you can ask questions of. Facebook, love it or loathe it, is a fantastic place to find that information. So if you just put in parent carer support group, and they will be able to give you information. You could say, ask questions about siblings, about your children. Does anyone know about any groups, etc.? And that's how these groups all get known, is just through the sharing of information. We are huge advocates of peer-to-peer support, be that parent to parent or sibling to sibling, and really do go and search out that information. And for professionals as well, they're a wonderful place to share your information. If you're running any groups of or sort of locally, and they might be suitable for siblings, then share that information through the parent carer networks. So that is our presentation over with. I can see there's some questions in the chat, so I'm going to stop screen sharing. I should say, just for disclosure, that these are actually my three children in this last photograph. So Edward is in the middle with his two older sisters. And they really do have a wonderful, wonderful, close, loving relationship like that. Edward is non-verbal and profoundly autistic, but the three of them just get on beautifully. And to be honest, they were the reason I did my PhD and the reason I was so interested in siblings.